biggest opportunity to improve this process. So let's go ahead and jump in. Sweet, clicker. All right, I'm gonna talk to 3 key points today. First, I'm going to unpack a costly problem and a time-consuming roadblock that many folks in this room and here at this conference are facing. Next, I will walk through how this problem is tracking to grow into an even bigger bottleneck due to a lot of changes in regulations that we're seeing. Third, I'm going to give some good news on how we can overcome some of these challenges, manage some of these challenges through technology. So first, let's talk about the problem. Most projects require approvals from local, state, and federal environmental authorities, and fatal flaws in that process can often lead to timeline delays, budget overruns, or total project risk. Why? I'll offer up 3 very common reasons. Environmental constraints weren't considered early enough in the project planning process. Number 2, new regulations change those development standards. Or 3, public perception of the project can influence permitting decisions. And to make this problem worse, the game really is changing. We're seeing a lot of changes to these types of issues. There are new regulations and changes that are making this environmental permitting process more difficult and more complicated than ever. They are happening every day, and we're going to talk through a few of those changes here in just a minute. I happen to know a bit about this problem because, just take a minute to talk about myself, I, true confession, used to identify as an environmental consultant, or at least I used to before I turned to technology to solve a lot of these problems. I've been in environmental consulting for 16 years for multiple industries, including renewable energy. I have surveyed swamps in chest waders. I have gone down caves looking for salamanders. I have almost thrown up in helicopters looking for eagles, and I've gone head-to-head with the federal, state, and local agencies on permitting projects for tens of thousands of miles of utility lines and hundreds of thousands of acres of energy and real estate projects. I've seen what can go wrong. I've seen what happens when these changes are unanticipated, and I'm here today to talk a little about what those are and to offer some solutions so that we can help solve a big part of this permitting bottleneck. All right, so the first change in environmental regulations I want to talk about is waters. One of the most common environmental constraints encountered by land development as a whole, but certainly our renewable energy customers, is water. That's specifically those rivers, streams, and wetlands regulated by the Clean Water Act or the state or the local agencies. Waterways are subject to some major regulatory whiplash. This summer, we had what is probably the most significant change to wetlands regulations in the last couple of decades. The landmark Supreme Court case, Sackett versus EPA, severely limited the numbers of waters that are regulated by the federal government. The EPA, following the court case, then made it official in their new rule that they launched earlier this summer. I'm going to qualify this EPA rule by saying that it's actually been enjoined by the courts. So we have this new rule is active in about 50% of our states, and the old rule, which manages more wetlands, is active in the other 50% of the states. This creates just kind of this mosaic of uncertainty as the rules could change again at any moment based on court decisions. It's even more likely to change if we have a change in administration in 2024. In fact, to exemplify this, just last week, House Democrats introduced the Clean Water Act of 2023, which is intended to, quote, undo the damage of Sackett. Unlikely that this act will pass, but it certainly exemplifies how kind of the roller coaster that this waters issue is on. Practically for you guys, this means that when you're planning a project, impacts to streams and wetlands that may impact streams and wetlands, really the protection status of those resources could change between now and when you actually go to permitting or when you actually go to construction. So we always recommend this, but it's more important than ever. Impact minimization and avoidance is so key to offset for this uncertainty. Let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of this change, this rule. Pros, I'm going to say that with like an asterisk. We now have fewer areas that require federal permitting because we're protecting fewer wetlands. I guess that's a yay. We may open up more development opportunities nationwide, but really we could consider that a con because we may lose a significant amount of wetland habitats, which are honestly some of our nation's most major sources of carbon sequestration. So for this industry, it's a little ironic to remove wetlands to put in clean energy. So more like a con. Also, from the regulatory perspective as a con, we are probably going to see more states stepping up to regulate impacts at the state level, again, introducing more of that regulatory uncertainty. Okay, here you can see the states with the more stringent state level wetland protection in blue, and the states with the least state level wetland protection in orange. Since we're here at GridTech Northeast, it's relevant to point to the cluster of blue states in the Northeast, that is New York, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island, DC, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. These are all current states that currently have a pretty high level of wetland protection. I want to talk about one of these states very specifically here in just a minute. So while the federal government is decreasing the amount of protected wetlands, at least for now, New York is actually increasing their protections. So in New York, there's an article called Article 24 that grants the state the ability to regulate impacts to wetlands and a 100-foot buffer around those wetlands. Historically, wetlands that were subject to Article 24 had to be greater than 12.4 acres. And for the statute, they had to be drawn or delineated on this special set of maps that was created and curated by the New York DEC. These two requirements essentially limited the number of wetlands that were regulated under Article 24. However, as I prompted you guys earlier, the game is changing. In 2022, the New York legislature expanded the authority of DEC to regulate wetlands. So there's two big changes that are coming. Number one, as of January 1st, 2025, state mapped wetlands will no longer be the only state regulated wetlands. Rather, any wetland that meets DEC criteria can be classified as a state wetland, even if they are not mapped, as long as they are still over that 12.4 acres in size. Smaller wetlands of special importance will still be considered state wetlands. Number two big change is that on January 1st, 2028, which is a few years from now, but we know these projects have long lead times, so something to think about. The state wetland size requirement will be reduced from 12.4 acres to 7.4 acres, which is going to obviously increase the number of wetlands that are regulated by the state. So this has two big implications. Now that more wetlands will be under state jurisdiction and that these net new wetlands are probably not going to be mapped, developers will need to be extra vigilant in these early project stages, as wetlands and their 100-foot buffers can significantly limit a project footprint and an overall buildable area of a project. This could be especially impactful for small projects like battery storage or community solar projects, which are primarily sited on smaller 30 to 50 acre sites. The second implication that we have for this is that as wetlands that are not mapped on online DEC wetland mappers could be now considered state wetlands, developers really should schedule their wetland delineations much earlier in the project planning phase to better anticipate those difficult permitting and setback issues. So where are, if I was a developer, I would be asking myself with this news, where are the streams and wetlands on my land projects? Which ones are protected? Which ones aren't? What about these magical, mystical, unmapped waters, how much developable area is left after all of this. Hang tight, we're gonna talk about a couple more regulations that are changing, and then I'm gonna introduce you to some technology that can actually help answer those questions in just a few seconds. But first, in the spirit of Halloween being next week, and because we need to talk about it anyway, so let's talk about bats. Up here in the Northeast, we are no stranger to bat issues. New York is unfortunately ground zero for white nose syndrome, found in a cave about 200 miles from here. It's a deadly fungus that has killed millions of bats since 2006 when it was discovered. It has led to U.S. Fish and Wildlife listing several bats as protected under the Endangered Species Act, as well as state regulators protecting them on their state-listed species. Most recently, the northern long-eared bat was promoted from threatened to endangered in March of this year, and we expect a listing decision on the tricolored bat sometime very soon. So bats really love to hang out in trees and in caves, and because the biggest threat to the bat is from this fungus, not from habitat destruction, which is a more common reason for endangered species, usually avoiding tree clearing during the maternity season, that is when bats are out and about having babies, which means tree clearing in the winter when all the bats are like tucked away in their caves, usually can keep you from having to do any federal or state permitting, staying away from the caves they live in, which are called hibernacula, which, like, not unironically also rhymes with Dracula. I'm obsessed with Halloween right now. Will prevent, and staying away from those kinds of things really can prevent the need for state and federal permitting. So the implication here with these changes to these endangered species listings is that because this is such an easily avoidable issue through like choosing what season you're doing the clearing in, it's really imperative and easy to seek that bat location information from U.S. Fish and Wildlife or from the state or from a local biological expert as early in the planning project as possible. Some news relevant to specifically to the renewable industry. About 2 months ago, a study came out in the UK that found negative impacts to bats from solar panels. Bats were found to avoid sites with solar panels when compared to a similar undeveloped site. It's of course way too early for policy implications, but the study does note that choosing sites in consideration of environmental constraints like the bat is especially prudent as we are still learning the impacts of all of this solar development to the local ecosystems. The study also suggests, if anyone's proactive here, which I always recommend, there are some opportunities to help the bats actually by planting native trees along the boundaries of solar farms to ultimately help increase insect populations, which we know is the bat snack of choice. So when you're siting a project, how can you quickly gauge the risk for bats and other species? It used to be a giant research project. I suggested 3 different places you could call just now with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the state, and local experts, but it doesn't have to be quite that hard. There are ways in tech we can answer these questions now, and I'm going to talk about that here in just a second. So lastly, I want to talk through NEPA, which is like this big bad word you hear about in the news, NEPA development, and it can be a problem for certain types of developments. So I'm going to do a quick refresher on what NEPA is, and then talk through some of the changes we've been seeing. So NEPA, which stands for the National Environmental Policy Act, is America's umbrella environmental permit. It was passed by Richard Nixon on New Year's Day in 1970, and from it, all other environmental regulations have been birthed, things like the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and Superfund, etc. NEPA permitting, as a refresher, is required for projects that are considered major federal actions, usually those on federal lands or those that have federal funding. If anyone's ever been through it, it's an incredibly burdensome process. Protracted NEPA reviews have tied up both high-profile and low-profile projects for years in the past. So for the past decade, every administration has tried their hardest to reform NEPA with very little success until in June of this year, with the passage passage of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. The Biden admin snuck in some NEPA reform for the first time in its 50-year history. However exciting that sounds, the act actually just codifies kind of how the federal government does things anyways. So there's not huge actual practical change here, but for the one most interesting change is that now when it comes to timelines and these like long protracted processes, there is now the ability for you as a developer applicant to petition for court-imposed timelines, and that could help move along some of our stalled energy projects. If you do most of your work on private land, honestly, NEPA might not affect you very often, and consider yourself lucky that it doesn't. If you cross state borders or you develop on federal land, then NEPA will almost certainly impact your project timeline. However, we do have something called a FAST Act, which stands for Fixing America's Surface Transportation. Renewable energy production projects have been included as an available project under the FAST Act for some time. Recently, this year, we added energy storage to the FAST Act, which should, in quotations, as with all good things with the federal government, help fast track approvals for solar and battery storage projects. It may help, it does this by some early agency coordination, enforcing schedules, and shortening time frames for legal challenges, which is where a lot of projects get hung up. Of note, as always, there are still more changes coming. There are more changes afoot in the CEQ, what they call Phase 2 rules, some of which actually appears to make NEPA more complicated, again, as the federal government does. So we may have mitigation for more kinds of projects, expanded climate change analysis for impacts, and then interesting allowing innovative approaches to permitting, which may actually bias towards or against certain types of energy projects. So BATS, wetlands, NEPA, these are just a few of the most recent environmental changes that will affect how you guys permit your projects. And there are honestly a lot of others. So let's talk about next how you can proactively manage some of these issues so that they don't become a bottleneck. So environmental permitting is rarely the most, I would say never, rarely, probably has been in the past, the most expensive part of a project, but it can very easily become the most time consuming. But there are some things that you can do to help. So number one, I'm gonna put on a realtor hat here, right? Location, location, location. We all know this is true with interconnect, but this is also true with environmental constraints. Consider those environmental constraints as early in the planning process as possible. Whether you call a consultant, whether you use in-house GIS, whether you use a site planning tool, small teaser for what's to come, doing your due diligence early is key. I can't tell you how many times I could have saved my clients time and money had they come to me earlier when they were thinking about building on a site as opposed to when they'd already committed to a particular site. Number two, avoid and minimize. Don't assume you can deal with it later. As we've seen today, these regulations are changing all the time. And so something that is not regulated today could very well be regulated by the time you go to construction. Number three, once you have identified where those environmentally sensitive areas on your site, get a good grasp of what that means for your timeline. And most importantly, have a backup plan for what happens if that timeline goes, how do I say this politically correctly, to the grabber, right? These three steps collectively we call due diligence. And right now there's a very time-consuming way to process or to do this due diligence. We're talking something like 3+ weeks. It's the world that I came from. Let's talk through that process so you guys can kind of see the steps and then about how we can do it in 3 minutes instead. So this is the typical due diligence process for our developer clients. Here's the process you currently face. So you can kind of think about it in 4 phases. When a solar developer is often looking to build a project, there's certain things he or she looks for first. Minimum acreage, flat, near a transmission line or substation, etc. The process to gather, synthesize, and relay that information we hear probably takes about 3 days. Then Maybe they start diving deeper into development risks that are actually on that site. Things like wetlands, flood zones, general species ranges, historic areas, things that they may have to bring up some GIS layers for, maybe track down some data layers from the web. Again, gather, synthesize, relay, another 3 days. The third is the actual critical issues analysis. Everything gathered so far really doesn't tell you about the environmental risk of a particular piece of property. What about unmapped flood zones, permit requirements and timelines, local setbacks, archaeological sites? Any one of these things, not to mention some of the issues we talked about today and hundreds of others, could very easily derail a project. To find that information, a developer almost always used to call me as a consultant. You hire a third party typically. And in my experience, that process generally takes another 3 weeks, which leads us to the fourth phase. You've paid a consultant or third party or in-house to tell you what problems you face, and now you're going to spend more time and money to learn how to fix it. So there are some publicly available tools, and I wanted to make sure you guys knew about them because they can be helpful in some cases. So you can find a lot of information in these tools. Is this helpful? Yes, sort of. This is a great list if you want to DIY it. Unfortunately, none of these are comprehensive, and most of them are maps that tell you where something is, but doesn't tell you why it matters. An interesting use case is the site renewables right map, which is the top one there, hosted by the Nature Conservancy. We're hearing from a lot of our developer customers that this map is too generic and fairly misleading, implying that areas that are not good, it says that their areas are not good for development, but when doing an actual site-specific desktop analysis or review, we're finding that those areas are perfectly feasible to develop in. So we don't want those maps to be limiting in where you're choosing to develop. We consider this kind of DIY, incomprehensive, I'm not quite sure which one it is, the old way, and we also feel like it's broken. Cobbling together 20 or 30 disparate data sources, each from different formats, using a third party, DIYing it, ultimately waiting weeks maybe to get an answer back from a third party on your risk is just inefficient, error-prone, and expensive. We've learned from our customers, fun fact, that when looking for the right place to build, 9 out of 10 sites are discarded. 9 out of 10 sites ultimately fail to meet the right buildable criteria. Because it historically takes days or weeks to assess one of these sites, that means we're talking about hundreds of thousands or hundreds of hours, right, hundreds of hours of wasted time looking at a single site, which is ultimately disqualified, massive waste of time. We know that critical issues and fatal flaws, when uncovered too late in the project development cycle, can lead to a lot of money that's wasted on issues that could have ultimately been resolved had they been uncovered earlier. And then, as we've talked about today, permitting is complex and it's changing all the time. There is inconsistency across jurisdictions, things are changing, and managing that permitting process is very manual and prone to error. But the good news is there is a better way. Talk a little bit about what we do now. Here at Transect, we are the first to solve this problem. I'm sure we won't be the last. The point today is to talk about and to give kind of a case study example of how technology can solve some of these bottleneck problems and how you can use it to overcome. So at Transect, we are helping developers find, assess, and select the best sites within minutes as opposed to that days or weeks. We have digitized that process through software built by environmental experts like me. We call ourselves recovering consultants, to save time, cut costs, and reduce risk. Ultimately, again, a case study on how we can use technology to accelerate land development, minimize those permitting delays, and ultimately de-risk those decisions. There's 2 use cases where technology makes total sense in these early phases, where we don't have to do things the old research-driven way. One, in accelerating how quickly you guys find sites to build on. We want you guys to be able to secure the best project forward with confidence that there are no fatal flaws. Second use case, once that site has been found, doing a deeper assessment of that land for detailed risk, buildable area, and permit matrix. Again, this should be able to be done in just a couple minutes. There is no reason why we have to do it the old way. What is the underlying magic here? By combining complex data, expert intelligence, and again, finding ways to use technology to productize all of this together, developers now have options for immediate, actionable insights during siting as opposed to waiting. There's a lot of data out there, and it's almost impossible to curate and maintain it all without harnessing both technology and the expertise to interpret it. We are curating on a daily basis the most comprehensive data for your industry with over 900 public and proprietary data sets. One example of the proprietary data that we offer, and I just cannot get away from Halloween references today, is our data set that we refer to as Ghost Waters, 365 days a year, not just this week. It's basically a proprietary data set that is mapping previously unknown waterways. There's dry streams that may all of a sudden have water in them during a storm event, and those streams can be regulated. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, depending on who's in charge of the government that day. And not knowing where those map streams are can have big implications for project buildability and permitting. We also offer on-demand environmental due diligence reports so that you guys can understand those permitting timelines ASAP, along with actionable recommendations. Again, we do not need to be waiting days for this kind of information. It's out there. Sometimes you need boots on the ground, and coordinating that is yet another timeline hurdle that is not necessary in our journey to the energy transition. We offer a marketplace where developers can connect with Transect curated consultant partners to conduct field surveys, things like Phase 1 ESAs and wetland delineations. Again, we are the first to solve this problem, and we won't be the last. The point is we need to find technology solutions to meet our energy transition goals at all phases of the development process, and we're just one example. Year to date, by evaluating 135 million acres with Transect, this process has helped developers like y'all save over 800,000 hours and more than $15 million versus doing it the old way. Again, there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing it better. A few slides back, when I was talking about the problem, I mentioned how public perception can affect the permitting outcomes on a renewable energy project. I know I'm being totally Captain Obvious here, but you all know, I saw some nods earlier, that community sentiment is one of the biggest pain points in development right now. A couple of stats: over 100 localities nationwide have adopted policies to block or restrict renewables development, and more are getting added all the time. Last year, there were at least 45 groups or pages on Facebook dedicated to opposing solar projects. Only 9 existed in 2020, and half of that 45 was added in 2021. The groups together have nearly 200,000 members, showing that this is an exponential problem that's growing. We asked our developer clients how they tackle this problem, and we got some interesting insight. During siting, they are doing a whole lot of manual research. We're looking at existing projects, news articles, local ordinances, maybe asking local real estate firms or land acquisition companies to give their pulse on the community sentiment. When siting a project though, doing all of that research on multiple sites is really just not feasible, and again, error prone. We here at Transect like to use technology to solve problems, so we are currently exploring the use of AI in predicting community sentiment in our new solar pulse tool. This is newly launched and currently being tested by your peers in the industry, but we are using AI to identify keywords and phrases that are related to solar energy across a wide spectrum of online sources using natural language processing. We're then using advanced sentiment analysis to categorize and then implementing machine learning models on top of that to continuously track that sentiment, trending over time, allowing, again, developers to really gauge that public perception in just minutes and make those informed decisions. So it's going to be really hard, actually impossible, again, preaching to the choir here as we're talking about interconnect, to secure the volume of land that we need for the energy transition if we keep doing things the old way. The need is too great, and the timeline is really too short to be wasting time and money on these old processes. That's what I love about the renewable space. I feel like we are looking for new ways to do things better. We do need a different way of doing things in all phases of project development to ultimately cut those costs, but more importantly, do this faster. There's said it a million times, there's no reason why we have to keep doing things the old way when we have a host of technology that can help us do it faster. We have a really big problem with interconnection. I know that's why a lot of us are here today, and we really don't need to add environmental, permitting, and community constraints to that big challenge that we're already facing. These problems can be solved by technology, honestly. We can leverage tech to